Okay, this is video 2 of the summer government class. And before I get started on today's topic, I wanted just to re-emphasize the lesson in the first day or two about the theories of John Locke and how they were then adopted and enshrined in the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson. And, you know, you might think that these notions about people having natural rights that can't be taken away, or human rights as we might call them today, and that government is to serve the will of the people, we kind of take those notions for granted today because we've lived with those as our founding principles in this country for over 200 years. But at the time John Locke wrote them down, they were incredibly revolutionary. No one had ever had a government like that anywhere in the world in human history. And in fact, John Locke had to go into hiding after his writings were published. And then he delayed some more of his writings for many years for fear of persecution. So these notions that were written into our Declaration of Independence were incredibly revolutionary. All of the governments that had existed anywhere in the world up until this time had always been run by monarchs, kings, or dictators, military rulers, and the rule was basically might makes right. If I have a stronger army than you, I get to rule, and you have to say what I do without question. And my authority cannot be questioned. That was how the world had operated up until this time. Okay, so I just wanted to reemphasize that and just get you to think about how new those ideas were. Okay, today's topic is about the meeting that took place in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1787, which became known ultimately as the Constitutional Convention. And this meeting was called because as you know, under the nation's first constitution that was drafted after the Declaration of Independence was adopted, was known as the Articles of Confederation. And it made a very weak national government. In fact, it had almost no power, and all of the power was retained by the 13 separate states. And this led to incredible chaos and trade wars and lack of any cooperation amongst the states. And after a number of years, that experience, it looked like this new baby country was about to fall apart. So this meeting was called, and representatives from every state was invited, and 12 states chose to send representatives. Rhode Island said we're not interested. So the meeting took place in Philadelphia. But let me just go over, before we talk about that meeting, about the real weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. Because if you keep those in mind, then you can really see how the new government that was formed under the U.S. Constitution was a real improvement, how many differences it had. Well, the Articles of Confederation called for a national government that consisted of only one branch. It was a Congress. And it was a unicameral, or one-house Congress. And in it, every state, regardless of how many people lived in the state, had one vote. And it was very difficult to pass laws in that Congress because 9 of the 13 states had to vote in favor of a proposed law for it to pass. It was more than just a simple majority. And if the Congress wanted to amend or change the Articles of Confederation, they had to get agreement by all 13 members of Congress. So that was extremely difficult. And as we said, Congress had no power to tax. That was it could only ask the states for money. So if a government can't raise money, it really can't do much of anything. And it had no power to regulate trade. So there were trade wars going on between the states. So Pennsylvania farmers couldn't sell their produce across the border in Maryland and vice versa. So this is the building, which is now called Independence Hall, where the delegates met. And it's in this very same room where the Declaration of Independence was drafted and adopted. And as I said, 12 of the 13 states sent representatives, so there were a total of 55 men. They were all white, male landowners. And their original purpose was try to fix the Articles of Confederation to get over these various weaknesses. But after about 5 days of trying to do that, they just threw up their hands and said, there's nothing we can do to fix these. They're too broken. So they said, we got to scratch them and start over. Okay? So they appointed or elected George Washington, one of their 55 members, to preside over the meeting. Another Virginian, James Madison, took very careful notes of all of the work done at this meeting that became known as the Constitutional Convention. And the men who ultimately drafted the U.S. Constitution are known as the Founding Fathers. And there's, I think, the video that you're going to watch, that's the link. And there are really two types of government that the men were considering. One was a democracy. And you think, well, don't we have a democracy? Oftentimes these two types of government are really not distinguished, but they really are different. So it's important to keep the difference in mind. And this is the difference. A democracy is where every single citizen in the country directly participates in every decision that the government makes. It would be like today if all the citizens of the U.S. went to Washington, D.C. and voted on everything that Congress was deliberating on. Okay? Obviously, in a large nation like ours, or of any size, that's just not practical. And most people just aren't interested in spending their time doing that. So the other form of government is known as a republic, and that's where the citizens of the country vote to elect representatives that then go and make up the government, and they're the ones that then discuss and vote on laws and different things the government does. But those representatives are still responsible to the people, so if they do something that the people that elected them don't like, then in the next election they can replace them with someone else. And it was this Republican form of government that these 55 men in Philadelphia just chose for their new government. Well, at the Constitutional Convention, and once they decided to start over from scratch and write a new constitution, they sat down throughout the summer, and it took them 3 months. And it was a very hot summer, no air conditioning, but they kept the windows closed because they decided to work in secrecy because they didn't want the press reporting on their everything that they were doing. And there were 3 big issues that divided the 55 men at this meeting. And there had to be compromises reached on these 3 main issues before a new government could be agreed upon and decided. And so what we have is the Constitution that we have today is really a bundle of compromises amongst some on some very divisive issues and strong points of view on each issue. So we're going to talk about each one of those 3 big issues and what the compromise was that resolved the differences that allowed the U.S. Constitution to be written. Okay? Well, the first one was, well, we know that the national government was too weak under the Articles of Confederation, so we needed to make it stronger. But just how strong should it be? And how much and what powers should the national government have? Because the more power the national government has, by definition, then the less power that each of the 13 states have. Okay? So that was the first issue. The second issue was, well, if we're going to continue to have a Congress, a lawmaking body, how are the various states going to be represented in that new Congress under this new Constitution? Should it continue to be one vote, one state, or should it be somehow based upon some other basis for representation? So that was the second issue. And then the third issue was, well, that really came, the third issue arose as a result of a resolution of the second issue. So I'm going to just hold off on discussing the third issue until later. So there were, as I said, there had to be three major compromises on these three issues. And, well, the first one was relatively easy. They decided on a Republican form of government, and they just decided that the national government had to be substantially strengthened, okay? So that was the agreement there. This next issue is, well, this new Congress we're going to have that's going to be much more powerful, how are states going to be represented? And there were two basically opposing plans or proposals set forth. The first one was set forth by James Madison of Virginia, so it was known as the Virginia Plan, and it said that representation in Congress should be based upon a state's population. So that, let's say, for every 100,000 people, a state would get one representative. So the states with large populations, like Virginia, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, New York, would have, you know, maybe 10, 12, 15 representatives, and the small population states would only have 1, 2, or 3. So as you might expect, the large population states all favored and supported the Virginia Plan. A second plan was put forth by this gentleman of William Patterson of New Jersey. And New Jersey was a relatively small population state, so he proposed that no, let's keep Congress the same as it was under the Articles of Confederation, with every state having the same number of votes, regardless of size. And obviously that plan, the New Jersey Plan it was called, was supported by the small population states. So this was really a divisive issue that they hotly debated for many days and just could not reach a resolution. And unless and until they reached a resolution on this issue, there was not going to be a new constitution. So finally, a guy by the name of Roger Sherman, I know it's kind of scary looking there, but he was a representative from Connecticut. He came up with a compromise plan. And his plan was known as the Connecticut Compromise, but it was eventually adopted, and because this compromise plan resolved this second big issue, this plan became also known as the Great Compromise. So what was the Great Compromise? Basically what it did is it took the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan and it put them together. So it said, instead of having a one-house or unicameral Congress, we're going to have a two-house Congress or a bicameral Congress. Bi, B-I, like bicycle, meaning two, uni versus meaning one. So one of the houses of Congress was going to be like under the Virginia Plan, where representation was going to be based on population, so the large population states would have more representatives, and that house was going to be known as the House of Representatives. And then a second House of Congress that was going to be called the Senate would be like the New Jersey Plan, where each state would be equally represented. And what the decision is that in the Senate, each state would have 2 representatives, or 2 senators, as we call them. So this Great Compromise Plan is what allowed the convention to go forward and continue drafting the Constitution, the rest of the government, and it's what we still have today. So we have a bicameral 2-house Congress with a House of Representatives, with representatives based upon the population of each state, and a Senate with two senators per state. Okay. Then the third big issue came up because, well, if you decide that you're going to have one of the houses of Congress, the House of Representatives, based upon the population of the state, then what population are you going to count? Are you going to count the slaves? Okay. And because slaves at that time, at least the southern states, did not consider slaves to be people. They considered them to be property. However, once they decided that the House of Representatives was going to be based upon population, the southern states, where over 90% of the slaves were, said, oh, well, for purposes of the House of Representatives, we want to count all the slaves, because that would make their population much larger. For example, North Carolina had more slaves than white people, so that would more than double their representation in the House of Representatives. In the northern states, some of whom had actually outlawed slavery by this time, or just didn't have slaves because they had no need for them, said, no, we don't think slaves should be counted for purposes of representation in the House of Representatives. So this was the third big divisive issue. And so what was the compromise? The compromise that was reached on this issue is known as the 3/5 compromise. So for purposes of determining representation in the House of Representatives, slaves were to be counted everywhere, but they were only going to be counted as 3/5 of a person. Okay? How they got to that fraction, I still don't know. So if someone wants to research that and let me know, that would be wonderful. Okay? And then another big compromise that was also reached was, I told you about how the National Congress under the Articles of Confederation had no power to regulate trade. So there were all these trade wars and barriers between the states. And you just can't have a national economy with that situation. So, but the southern plantation owners who were growing cotton and tobacco and exported a lot, they were afraid to give this new National Congress a lot of power over trade, because they were really afraid that this Congress might start taxing exports. And they exported a lot of cotton and tobacco to Europe and places. So what the compromise was on trade is that Congress would have the power to regulate trade between the states, but could not tax exports. Congress could, and then another part of that was that the president, as part of the Great Compromise, not only did it create a bicameral Congress, but it also created two more branches of the national government. An executive branch headed by a president, this president, one of his or her power was going to be able to make treaties with foreign governments. But the treaties had to be approved by the Senate, one of the houses of Congress. The third branch of the government that was created under the Great Compromise was was the judicial branch. And that created a federal or national court system. And we will be studying all three of these branches of the federal government in a couple of weeks. Okay, I think that's about all. I'm going to stop here, and then I'm going to add a second or a third video lecture, which I'll call Video 2 Part 2, to talk really about the framework and other components of the U.S. Constitution. Okay, thanks. Have a good weekend.